Grace stood before the large crowd in the church, her voice filled with authority and passion. God is in this house tonight. Somebody shout hallelujah. She declared, her hands raised towards heaven. The congregation erupted in praise, their voices blending into a powerful roar. People had come from far and near to see Grace, the minister whose prayers healed the sick and gave hope to the broken. Tonight was no different. A woman with crutches suddenly dropped them, shouting, I can walk. Tears streamed down her face as she took a first step unaided in years. A man in a wheelchair stood up and began running around the room, his cries of joy echoing through the air. Grace smiled, but her heart felt heavy. She saw the miracles, the healings, and the transformed life. Yet inside, she felt broken, like a fraud. As the service ended, people rushed to touch her and thank her, but she quickly slipped away, avoiding the crowd. She made her way to the office and locked the door. Leaning against it, she closed her eyes and whispered, God, help me. Please, not tonight. Her breathing grew heavy and her hands shook as she grabbed her phone. She scrolled through old messages and pictures of random men she had met at nightclubs. She tried to resist the growing urge, but it was like a fire consuming her from the inside. No, she muttered, throwing the phone onto the desk. Tears streamed down her face as she fell to her knees. God, why can't I stop? I don't want this. I don't want to disappoint you. But the urge was too strong. She pulled out a wig and sunglasses from her drawer, wiped her tears, and forced a smile in the mirror. No one will know, she whispered, grabbing a bag and leaving through the back door. Grace's life hadn't always been this way. She was once a happy little girl, loved deeply by her parents. Her father was a tall, kind man who always called her my little butterfly. Her mother was her best friend, always chasing her around their small village home, laughing and playing. Grace, come here, her mother would call, pretending to chase her. You can't catch me. Grace would laugh, running straight into her father's arm. Their laughter filled the air until one tragic day when everything changed. A loud explosion shook the village. Her father had gone to investigate, but he never returned. Soon the news came that both her parents had died in the explosion. Grace, just 5 years old, was left alone. Neighbors whispered as they watched her sit outside their home crying. Both of them gone? One woman asked in disbelief. Poor child, what will happen to her now? Her mother's elder sister, Auntie Maria, soon arrived. Maria was a kind woman and a nurse who worked tirelessly to care for others. You will live with me now, she told Grace gently. I will take care of you. Grace moved into Auntie Maria's small but tidy house. It was long before Grace noticed how busy her aunt was. Maria worked long hours at the hospital to provide for her family, often coming home late at night, exhausted. At first, Maria's husband, Uncle Clement, seemed friendly. He smiled at Grace and welcomed her into their home. But one night, when Grace was just 8 years old, everything changed. That night, Clement crept into her room while Auntie Maria was at work. Shh, he whispered, his cold breath close to her ear. Don't make a sound or I will make you join your dead parents. Grace froze in terror as tears rolled down her cheeks. She did not dare tell Auntie Maria. Every time she tried, Clement's threat echoed in her mind. Over the years, the abuse continued, leaving scars so deep that even after she grew older, the memories still haunted her. And she became addicted to sex, and whenever the urge comes, she could not resist it. As Grace grew, it became clear she had a special gift. Whenever she prayed for someone, things happened. The sick were healed, broken hearts were mended, and people were drawn to her spirit. By the time she was in her 20s, she had become a powerful minister of the gospel, traveling from city to city, preaching and performing miracles. But beneath the surface, Grace carried a secret, a dark, unshakable addiction. The trauma from her childhood had left her with an overwhelming urge to seek out men, to drown her pain in fleeting moments of pleasure. Whenever the urge came, it was like a storm she could not control. She would disguise herself, wearing a wig and sunglasses, and sneak into nightclubs to pick random men. Afterward, she would cry for hours, begging God to forgive her. God, why? She would say after each encounter. Why can't I stop? I love you. I want to serve you. But this thing won't let me go. Grace's life became a painful circle of power and brokenness. By day, she was the anointed minister everyone admired. But by night, she battled the demons of her past, struggling to overcome the addiction that held her captive. Grace's life was so storm and she was caught in the middle of it. By day, she stood before thousands, a woman of power and purpose. She spoke with authority, prayed with fire, and carried the presence of God wherever she went. Her ministry was unlike any other. People called her the vessel of healing. Her schedule was packed with invitations to preach, crusades to lead, and prayers to offer. At every event, people were drawn to her. She would lay hands on the sick and they would recover instantly. Families on the verge of collapse would find peace after she spoke to them. Even hardened hearts would weep during a sermon. But Grace had a secret that ate away her soul every single day. One evening, after an especially powerful service, Grace sat in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had just prayed for a woman who had been diagnosed with cancer. The woman's tears came back clear, and she left the church rejoicing. People called it a miracle, and it was, but Grace felt no joy. Her reflection stared back at her, empty and accusing. She could feel it coming again. That pull, that ache deep inside her. It was as if her body was no longer her own. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. She clenched her fist and started pacing the room. God, not again. Please, not tonight. She fell to her knees, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. Lord, take this away from me. Please, I don't want to live like this anymore. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, hesitated, then grabbed it. Scrolling through her contacts, she saw the names of men she had met in the moment of weakness. Her thumb hovered over one name, and her breathing quickened. Stop, she said out loud, tears streaming down her face. Grace, stop. But it was too late. The pull was stronger than her prayers. She grabbed her wig and sunglasses, slipped out of her house unnoticed, and drove to a club on the other side of town. The club was loud and chaotic, filled with music, laughter, and flashing lights. Grace hated it, but at the same time, she felt numb. Disconnected from herself, she scanned the room, looking for someone, anyone, to quiet the storm inside her. A tall man caught her eye. He smiled at her and she nodded back. Within minutes, they were talking at the bar. He asked her her name and she lied. He asked what she did for a living and she dodged the question. They left together shortly after, and Grace slept with the man that night. By the time Grace got home, it was past midnight. She sank to the floor of her bedroom and began to cry uncontrollably. I am sorry, God, she whispered between herself. I am sorry. Please forgive me. I don't know why I keep doing this. I hate myself for it. I hate myself. She coiled up on the floor, her body shaking with guilt and shame. Days turned into weeks, and the circle continued. Grace would stand on the stage preaching and performing miracles, but the weight of her secrets grew heavier. She tried everything to break free. She fasted for days, prayed fervently, and even sought counsel from other ministers, but she never told anyone the full truth. How can I? She thought to herself, what would they think of me? I am supposed to be a servant of God, an example for others to follow. If they knew the truth, they would turn their backs on me. But the truth was eating her alive. Her past, the trauma she had buried for so long, was still haunting her. Grace often thought about her childhood, about the nights when Uncle Clement would creep into her room. She could still hear his threats. If you tell anyone, you will join your dead parents, he had whispered to her one night, his voice cold and manipulating. She wanted to tell Auntie Maria, but she was too scared. Her aunt was always so busy working late shifts at the hospital to provide for the family. Grace did not want to burden her, and she did not think she would believe her anyway. As the years passed, the abuse continued, leaving Grace with wounds that never healed. Even when she grew older and Uncle Clement stopped coming into her room, the damage was done. She carried the weight of shame and fear into adulthood, hiding it behind her ministry. But no matter how much she tried to bury it, the pain always found a way to surface. One day, after a particularly difficult service, Grace broke down into her office. She could not take it anymore. God, she cried, why did you choose me? I am not worthy. I can't even control myself. How can I help others when I am so broken? For the first time, she felt an overwhelming urge to tell someone the truth. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of Pastor Emmanuel, a counselor and fellow minister she trusted. When he answered, she hesitated. Pastor, I need to talk to you, she finally said. Her voice was shaky and she could feel the tears coming again. Of course, Grace, he replied gently. What is wrong? But as much as she wanted to tell him everything, the words would not come. Grace sat in silence after the call ended. She had picked up the phone, ready to share everything. The abuse, the addiction, the constant battle within herself, but the words just wouldn't come. It felt too raw, too terrifying. Instead, she locked herself away in her office for hours, staring at the wall, her mind a chaotic mess of guilt and shame. The pull of the addiction was like a weight on her chest, suffocating her. She had spent so many years pretending to be fine, pretending to be this holy, powerful woman of God, but inside she was breaking. That night she could not resist it. The storm inside her raged again. She grabbed her wig and sunglasses, knowing she was about to do something she would regret. She hated herself for it, but the temptation was too strong. She drove to the club once again, the familiar home of the city around her. She barely noticed the lights or the people. All she could think about was the emptiness she was trying to fill. When she entered, the noise seemed to swallow her whole. The bass from the music rattled her chest, and she scanned the room, looking for someone to take the pain away. A tall man with a confident smile approached her, and they began to talk. His voice was deep, smooth, and he seemed to understand her pain. They left together, and before she knew it, they had slept together, and the night was over. In the early hours of the morning, Grace found herself back in her room, standing before the mirror. Once again, the familiar wave of shame washed over her, and she collapsed onto the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. I can't keep doing this, God. I can't. Please, please help me. She felt empty, like a shell. She had sought comfort in the arms of strangers, but it only left her feeling more lost, more broken. She was ashamed to be seen by anyone, even God. The next few days were a blur of emptiness. Grace tried to focus on her ministry, but her heart wasn't in it. She went through the motions, praying for the sick, preaching to the congregation, but nothing felt real anymore. Her thoughts were constantly consumed by the shame of her actions. One afternoon, she sat in her office, her hands trembling. She looked at the phone again, considering calling Pastor Emmanuel. Maybe this time she could tell him. Maybe this time she could face the truth. As she picked up the phone, she was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Grace called, quickly putting the phone down. A woman entered the room. It was Rose, one of the leaders of the church women's ministry. Rose had been one of Grace's closest friends, always by her side, always supportive. "Grace," Rose said softly, sitting across from her. "You have been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Grace forced a smile. "I am just tired, Rose. I am fine." But Rose did not buy it. She studied Grace's face closely, noticing the worriness in her eyes. "No, you are not. Something is wrong, and I want to help you. We've been through a lot together, you know. You don't have to carry this alone." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She had always trusted Rose, but this felt different. The weight of her secret felt heavier now, as if it was pressing against her chest, trying to break free. "Grace, please," Rose continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "You don't have to be perfect. I know you think you have to be strong, but you don't. You can be vulnerable with me. Please, let me help you." Tears began to fill Grace's eyes. She wanted to open up, to tell Rose everything, but the fear gripped her heart. What if Rose looked at her differently? What if she was judged? What if everyone found out who Grace really was? "I can't," Grace whispered, shaking her head. "You would not understand. I don't even understand myself." Rose reached out, taking Grace's hand. "I don't need to understand everything, Grace, but I am here. You don't have to carry this burden alone." For the first time in a long time, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe there was a way out of this circle. Maybe, just maybe, she did not have to keep pretending. The next morning, Grace finally made the call. She dialed Pastor Emmanuel's number, her hands shaking. It rang for a few seconds before he answered. "Pastor, I need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, what's going on?" Pastor Emmanuel's voice was warm and comforting, but there was a sense of urgency in his tone. "I am struggling," she said, the words tumbling out. "Have been hiding it for so long, but I can't anymore. I am not the person everyone thinks I am. I have been living a lie. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Grace, Pastor Emmanuel said softly, I am so proud of you for taking this first step. You are not alone in this. God loves you and He will heal you, but you have to be honest with yourself. You have to face the past in order to move forward. That day, Grace sat in her office, her phone still warm in her hand. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. She wasn't perfect. She did not have all the answer, but she did not have to be. She was allowed to be broken. She was allowed to be healed. And the healing would come one step at a time. The next few weeks were both difficult and freeing for Grace. She had started a journey that she had long avoided, facing the painful truth of her past. Each day she took small steps towards healing. She leaned on Pastor Emmanuel, who guided her through counseling, and on Rose, who continued to support her with a love that felt like grace itself. Grace spent her nights praying, reading scriptures, and allowing herself to cry it all out. She confessed her sins to God, but more importantly, she confessed them to herself. The shame she had carried for so long slowly began to lift. But there were moments when the darkness would creep back in, reminding her of her past mistakes. Still, she fought. She prayed harder. She cried out to God for strength. One evening, Grace sat in her office reading a Bible. The words she had read so many times before now felt so different. They seemed alive. For I know the plans I have for you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. It was then that she realized something deep within her. God had always been with her, even in her darkest moments. He had never abandoned her, even when she had turned away from Him. Her phone buzzed and she looked at the screen. It was text message from Rose. How are you holding up? Can we talk tonight? I am here for you. Grace smiled softly, wiping away her tears. It had been weeks since she had allowed herself to feel this kind of peace. She sent a quick reply. Yes, I would love to. Thank you for being here. That evening, Grace and Rose met in Grace's office after the evening service. Rose arrived with a cup of tea, and the two women sat across from each other. The soft light from the lamp bathed the room with warmth, but there was still an air of heaviness between them. Grace, Rose began gently. I know it's been tough, but I also see you fighting. I see the strength in you, even when you don't feel strong. Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. It's hard, Rose. I've carried this secret for so long, and I feel so ashamed. Every time I think I am free, I find myself in the same place. I can't escape it. Rose placed her hand over Grace, her touch comforting. Healing isn't about escaping Grace. It's about accepting and moving forward. It's about letting go of what you can't change and trusting that God will help you become who He's always called you to be. Grace closed her eyes, letting Rose's words sink in. I've been running for so long, she whispered, from my past, from my addiction, from the truth. But I can't keep running. I need to face it all. The next step in Grace's healing journey was the hardest one yet. Confronting Uncle Clement, the man who had caused so much pain in her life, the man who had abused her for years. She had to face the consequences of his actions. Grace knew this confrontation wouldn't be easy, but she felt God's presence guiding her as she took this brave step. With Rose by her side, Grace traveled back to the small town where she had grown up, the place she had tried so hard to forget. As they drove through the familiar streets, Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, but she also felt something else, the power of forgiveness. When they arrived at her childhood home, Grace hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. Rose gave her a supportive smile. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm with you." Grace nodded, her voice shaking. "I am ready. I have to do this for me, for my healing." They approached the house where she had spent so many painful years. The house looked the same, but to Grace, it felt like a different place entirely. Uncle Clement was sitting on the porch as if nothing had changed. He looked up when he saw Grace and Rose walking towards him. There was a brief flash of surprise in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Grace," he said, his voice cold and distant, "what are you doing here?" Grace stood tall, her heart racing but her resolve strong. "Uncle Clement, I am here to tell you that I know what you did. I know what you did to me when I was a child, and I am not afraid of you anymore." Clement's face twisted in anger, his eyes narrowing. "You are lying. You don't know anything. You have always been a troublemaker." Grace took a deep breath, finding the strength she needed. "No, I'm not lying. I'm not the scared little girl you used to threaten. I am a woman of God and I've learned to forgive, but I will never forget what you did to me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back. "I am telling you this because I am free now. You no longer have any power over me. I am not the same person I was when I was a child, and I am not afraid to speak the truth anymore." For a moment, there was silence between them. Clement's face remained frozen, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps regret, perhaps fear. "Grace, he trailed off, not knowing what to say. "I forgive you, Uncle Clement," Grace said, her voice steady, "but that doesn't mean I will ever allow you to control me again. I am taking back my life. I am taking back my peace." That night, Grace and Rose sat in the car, the tension finally lifting. Grace had done it. She had confronted her past, and though it had been painful, she felt a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you for being here with me," Grace said quietly, turning to Rose. "I don't think I could have done it without you." Rose smiled warmly. "You have always had the strength, Grace. You just needed to remember it." Grace took a deep breath and smiled, finally at peace with herself. "I am not perfect. I have made mistakes, but I know that God's grace is bigger than any mistake I have made. I am ready to move forward to be the woman He has called me to be." And for the first time in a long time, Grace believed it. She wasn't just a woman of God. She was a woman who had fought for her healing, for her truth. She was no longer bound by her past. Grace was free. In the weeks that followed, Grace began a new chapter of her life. She poured herself into her ministry with a renewed passion. Her heart, once broken and heavy with shame, was now full of hope and healing. She felt the weight of her past no longer controlling her, and her relationship with God grew stronger than ever before. Grace started speaking openly about her struggles in a way that felt both vulnerable and empowering. During Sunday services, she shared her testimony, not as a woman who had everything figured out, but as someone who had experienced God's healing power firsthand. The congregation, moved by her honesty, began to open up about their own struggles. She led support groups for women who had experienced abuse, and even some of the men in the church came forward to share their battles with addiction, shame, and brokenness. Grace no longer hid in the shadows of her past. She used her story to help others in freedom too. One evening, after a powerful service, Grace sat quietly in her office. She was exhausted, but she felt at peace. As she prayed, she heard a whisper in her spirit, a message of encouragement from God. My daughter, I have healed you, not to keep you hidden away, but to set you free. You are no longer defined by your past. You are defined by my love. Continue to walk in truth and love, and you will see others set free by your story. I have redeemed you, and you will redeem others. The pain you carried was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to strengthen you. My grace is sufficient for you, and in your weakness, my power is made perfect. Tears filled Grace's eyes as she realized how far she had come. She had walked through the fire, but she had not been burned. God's grace had been her anchor through it all. Grace ministry flourished. She saw lives transformed as people reached out for healing, just as she had. And every day she was reminded of God's faithfulness to heal and restore. She knew that her story wasn't just for her, it was for anyone who had ever felt lost, broken, or addicted. One day, as Grace was preparing for a new sermon, she sat at her desk and wrote a letter to anyone who might be battling with addiction, shame, or pain. She wanted to speak directly to their hearts. To anyone struggling, to anyone who feels trapped in darkness, don't give up. I was once where you are. I was broken, ashamed, and addicted. But God has a plan for you, a plan to heal you, to redeem you, and to restore what the enemy has stolen. It's not easy. It takes courage to face your pain, but you don't have to do it alone. God's grace is greater than your struggle. He loves you deeply, and his arms are wide open, ready to embrace you. Healing is possible. Freedom is possible. In God, there is always hope. Grace went on to live a life full of purpose, healing others, breaking free from the chains of their past. She never forgot the lessons she had learned. Healing was a process. Forgiveness was powerful, and God's love had the ability to transform the darkest places into light. Moral lesson of this story is healing is a journey, not a destination. It's okay to be broken. It's okay to struggle, but don't let those struggles define you. God's love and grace are stronger than any addiction you are facing, any pain or any shame. No matter what you have been through, no matter how far you have fallen, God is always there waiting for you to take his hand and walk the path of healing. His grace is sufficient and his love is greater than your worst mistake. This is a message to anyone battling with addiction, to anyone who feels caught in the grip of addiction. Know this, you are not alone. Your struggles do not define you. You are a beloved child of God, and he wants to help you heal. The road may be tough, but God promises to walk with you every step of the way. His healing power is real. Take the first step, reach out for help, and trust that with God all things are possible. You can break free because he is your strength and your refuge. Healing is not just a dream, it is a promise. And with that, Grace stood tall, her heart filled with gratitude as she looked ahead to the many lives she would continue to touch, knowing that God had truly healed her to help heal others. The end. Thank you guys for watching the story. If you love this story and you've watched to this point, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join this amazing family for more stories like this, and also like this video and share with your friends and family. Bye till our next video.